You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
John, we have our guest, so I want to bring him into the program and welcome George Landrith is the president of Frontiers of Freedom. George, it's a pleasure to have you here on the Final Say Radio Show with Brett and John Rappaport. Welcome.
It's great to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, no problem whatsoever. And I just came back I took a very brief honeymoon trip up to New England, and I'm so glad that you're working on this story because it's such a beautiful place almost anywhere you go up in New England. And for them to want to put a windmill farm in the middle of something that's beautiful, first of all, I think it's preposterous. And the fact that it's probably not going to generate the energy that makes the cost or the assault on the beauty of the land worthwhile. I don't understand this, why they would do this to begin with. But I'll let you.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. It's the energy that it will produce, to the extent it produces energy, will be about 3 times as expensive as the traditional forms of energy, coal or gas or nuclear. Okay? So it's going to be way more expensive. The other thing that's odd about it is because it's wind energy, it's intermittent. So it doesn't actually mean you need to build fewer power plants. You still need those power plants because when the wind's not blowing, you got to run them. When the wind's blowing, you can cut them off a little bit or shut down certain portions of them. But when the wind's not blowing, and then you hit the other thing about the beauty, these are the equivalent of a 45-story building. They're 450 feet tall. And they're going to put like 130 of them in there. So imagine going along the Nantucket Sound and building 130 45-story buildings and then saying, yeah, that doesn't have any impact.
Wow. Now, there's one other thing. Is this a taxpayer-subsidized project?
Yeah, that's the real killer is people say to themselves, back to the idea of whether it works or not. Because, the truth is, if it works, that means someone will fund it, right? Because right now, all over the country, they're building, pizza parlors and, restaurants and movie theaters, and the government's not funding that. Just someone's doing it because they figure they can, make money doing it, right? So obviously, if they thought they could make money doing this, they wouldn't be asking the government for money. But the reality is they've not been able to get the funding that they need. They finally found somebody who says, in theory, we will lend you the money. But only, get this, only if the taxpayer will give us loan guarantees. Well, what that means is they figured out that it's a bad business model to sell energy that costs 3 times as much. And that's not a good business model, and so they might lose their money, but as long as the taxpayer will promise them they won't lose their money, then what the heck? Why not make the loan?
This is a particularly interesting subject to me. This is John Rappaport. It's nice to meet you, George. I have to tell you, I'm very passionate about this subject because I actually built a company one business ago which was focused on creating software layers for the electric grid that by design we're looking to seek significant efficiencies out of the grid. And what I think a lot of people don't understand when you look at these wind projects, you're right, they're very intermittent, but there's 2 major problems that occurs with the intermittency. First of all, where is the power needed and where will you get the power from if you have a reliance on these windmills? And also the base load issue. So I want you to touch on those a little bit, but I want to make sure people understand it's beyond just, we discussed last week, shredding of birds, and we discussed a little bit the fact that there's a huge environmental impact of putting these power lines in. But I wanted people to understand, even just the way power is consumed, that
right.
There's if you could discuss how these affect base load issues
right.
and how they compare to the reliable power sources we've had in the past.
Right. Well, example, if you have a factory, can you imagine running production on windy days but shutting down on days that it's not windy enough? But that's what effectively, if we become reliant on wind energy, then that means that, on windy days, you can turn on your lights and your air conditioning and your television. But on days when it's not windy, that day, no, you can't do that. The factory shuts down, the place of businesses, the law offices, every place that requires electricity, oh yeah, that won't work. And that's just a bad strategy. I mean, this is, places where they have intermittent power are third world countries. America is a first world economy, so we expect when we flip the light on for it to work. We expect that when we plug something in that it's going to work. And the same thing is true of our industry. So what will end up happening is they'll end up driving the industry out of that area if they become dependent on wind. Wind is at best a niche sort of thing because in our economy, you have industries that require power. I was talking just a couple weeks ago to a fellow who said his electric bill for he has essentially a server farm. He said the electric bill for his server farm is $1 million a month. Now, I don't know about you, but he's buying a lot of electricity. Now, imagine if his server farm works for his clients only on windy days. That's not really a serious approach to electricity, and that's why when people say things like it helps the environment, the reality is it doesn't, because you still have all the same power plants you used to have. Because if you don't, then you end up with on still days or on non-windy days, you've got no power.
Sorry, Joe, you're spot on, and that's the problem with the intermittency. People don't realize you cannot get rid of the baseload plants unless you can prove to me that we have heavy wind all the time, or you want to literally crisscross the entire country with a 10x factor of transmission, heavy transmission lines, and tear up what's left of our forests. You can't base load, you can't rely on your base load for wind. And so the reality is you cannot get rid of these power plants anyway, and you still have to own the infrastructure, because when the wind's not blowing, there's only three things you could do when the wind's not blowing. You could stop using power, which means you have to take draconian measures and turn everybody's thermostats, hot, etc. You can raise the cost of power to an exorbitant amount so commercial people can't afford to engage in commerce, or you can fire up base load or peaking plants, which are often diesel and very expensive to manage and operate. And so they look at the GE runs great ads with pretty green commercials to paint a picture, but it ain't as green as they make it seem. And I think that's the point you're making.
That's exactly right. And that's the problem with it is and how you know it's a loser is when because people will fund all kinds of things. I mean, people out there with money who want to invest in things that will work. But what we have here is they've had to go all the way to Japan to find a company that will say they'll finance them, and even they say that's conditioned upon the U.S. government promising taxpayer backup, meaning if this goes south and we lose our shirts, we get a check from the taxpayer to make sure we don't lose our shirts, and the taxpayer loses their shirts. Well, that just is not a good deal. I mean, this is like Solyndra. I mean, Solyndra was a plan in which a company was trying to make overpriced solar panels, and if you read their business model and their plan, and you could tell they weren't going to be profitable no matter what. It was simply not possible because they were selling them for too much. This is the same thing with this. These guys are selling electrical power, intermittent electrical power, at too high a price. It's simply not going to work. And we're being telegraphed by a Japanese bank, yeah, we don't think this is going to work either, but as long as you'll make sure we don't lose our shirt, what the heck, what do we care? Well, that's not real risk management when the bank says, we'll lend you money, but it's not going to be our money eventually. If it's lost, it's their money. So what happens is the taxpayer loses. If the thing goes south, which it seems like it would, the taxpayer's on the hook. If it turns out it's successful, guess who gets the money? Not the taxpayer, but the bank. So it's just a bad deal all the way around, whether you're a taxpayer, whether you're just looking to build a society that has sufficient power to have a growing economy, or whether you live in or travel to the Nantucket Sound and want it to be beautiful. I mean, on any conceivable basis, it's just lunacy.
Well, Solyndra was to crony capitalism what, the father with a car dealership who sold the most Girl Scout cookies, was to entrepreneurship. George, I want to give you a very relevant example of what you're talking about here. I spent a lot of time about 3 years ago with some of the major technology and financial planning folks of some of the Indian tribes, some of the more progressive Indian tribes. And these are folks who realized at some point that their people have made a lot of money, but they really don't want us, the two major sins, right, alcohol and gambling, to be the primary source of their people's income. And a few of these companies in particular, one tribe who I won't mention names for now, but one tribe was very impressive. They invested in all kinds of technologies and many different things. And we actually had this very conversation, and we talked about the efficiencies. One thing many of the Indian tribes have is a significant amount of open land, of mineral resources, and an ideal land where nobody's view would be blocked, and in some cases not in major migratory, bird migratory paths that would be ideal for this. But guess what? It wasn't economically viable. It was more economically viable for some of these people to build advanced aviation parts, or to build, the one tribe was building advanced data centers, and guess what kind of power they weren't using? In highly intermittent power. So these are the Indians, right, who even, by the way, have built into their corporate ethos a very green culture. I wanted to point that out before I hand this back to Brett.
George, I wanted to, I saw mention in your article here that the cost of this project is $2.6 billion. Do you know offhand what it would cost to build even a smaller size nuclear power plant?
Well, likely it would produce more electricity. I mean, so the problem will be is we have to compare, kind of apples to apples. Wind energy, well, if you have enough of them, you can produce some sizable amounts of energy. A nuclear power plant is a very dense power source, if you will, meaning that it can really, produce a lot of juice. And I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I will tell you that I think that it would cost more than that, but it doesn't cost more per kilowatt.
Right.
It's much more economical. So, it's in fact, nuclear is actually one of the most economical we have. And, of course, coal in the United States is economical. We have, new technologies where we can burn coal, and we have higher quality coal than many other countries. And then, of course, natural gas, which with fracking we have, plenty of. So all of these are substantially, usually by a factor of at least half. They cost about half, and in some cases a third. The most recent study I saw was that it was a third less expensive to produce energy, using nuclear than it is to do it via wind. Everyone that says it's free with its wind, you don't have to pay for the wind. It's like, yeah, I understand. You don't have to pay for the sun either, but solar energy is not free either. It's just a misnomer what you're paying for.
Well, there's several problems to look at here. One is that I believe in most cases when a nuclear power plant or an oil well or natural gas facility and coal plants are built, that they are funded by money, by private corporations.
Right.
And they're not guaranteed. Exactly. The other thing is that, one of the biggest problems I have with electric cars is the fact that you're making these batteries that are incredibly complex, where the technology isn't quite there, so they could be smaller. And then when these batteries wear out, what are you going to do with them? And I look at windmills and solar panels the same way. One is a lot of the components are being made overseas where, obviously nuclear energy and natural gas and oil could be developed here and creating American jobs and keeping money within our economy. And then the question is, what happens when the stuff wears out? What do you do with it?
Right. Well, you're right. The solar panels, when you include all the chemicals and other processes required to make them, they're far from green. And these windmills are produced. These will be produced overseas. They won't be U.S. windmills. And they're huge, and they actually sometimes have problems and will explode and create. I've seen some really amazing. They always show pictures of them when they're not moving, which of course means they're not doing anything, and they're not as offensive when they're not moving. But the problem is, you have the dangers of maintaining them, so they're dangerous for the people who maintain them. You get far more problems for the people fixing them than they do people fixing other kinds of power plants. The danger rate's substantially higher. But then, you see, they look like they're an electrical storm when they're going off, if there's a problem. It looks like lightning striking the ground because it, so it's just, I don't get the fascination with them. I understand that you can use them to, power bring in some water out of the ground to do your cattle or whatever. But that's an intermittent need. You can pump it out of the ground when it's windy, and when it's not, they drink the water that's already there. But you can't run a first world economy on intermittent power, and it makes no sense to try to run your economy on energy that costs twice as much or 3 times as much. I mean, think about it. You could also produce energy. I got a great way to produce energy. We're going to hire Donald Trump to ride a bicycle that has a generator attached to it, and we'll pay him hourly to generate electricity. And I could make electricity cost like 1,000 times more expensive than the other energy. But what would the point of that be? The answer is it would just make things more expensive. It's a stupid idea. We really ought to be producing energy at the most reasonable price possible. And that's why wind energy is not a viable option, just on cost alone.
Now, that sounds like a good fitness plan for America, but certainly not a good energy plan.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just picked him because I suspect he wouldn't come cheap. He wouldn't do it for a minimum wage. But my point is,
exactly.
you gotta have energy that makes sense, because we're going to try to fuel an economy. You're going to ask families in America to pay 3 times as much for this other energy. So it's not just factories. It's not just big business. It's mom and pop shops. It's mom and pops. It means they'll have less money to save for their kids' college, or to have them take piano lessons, or join little leagues, or join a scout troop. All these things, they're real costs. And what's the benefit? Beats me. I mean, right. It just strikes me as, this is the classic case of rent seekers coming in and saying, yeah, this doesn't fly, but if you'll give us a lot of money, we can make it fly, at least for a little while. And then eventually you'll lose your money, we'll go away, our people have made their money, and we'll just kind of shrug our shoulders. And I'm just like, we've been down this road, we've done this, we've seen this played out, and it's simply not right to ask a single mom who's working 2 jobs to tell her to get overtime this weekend and not be at home with her kids, so that we can fund some stupid project that isn't actually going to produce energy at a reasonable price, and it's not going to be reliable enough to actually run our economy on. But that's what they want to do. It's one thing if some guy wants to spend his own money to do it, but they're using the coercive power of government to tell people you have to work to pay for this stuff, and I just don't think that's right.
Exactly, and I filled up in New Jersey. And, I was complaining enough about the gas, but then I had to gas up on the way home in Connecticut. And that was incredibly high. And I'm just thinking to myself, for those who are poor or making less money than the average person, it's hurting you significantly more. And it's like a tax, or really almost a war on the poor when you raise the price of energy. And I just think to have to pay over $4 for a gallon of gas is really outrageous, considering the fact that we have so many resources here in this country, and that the government is almost perfectly doing this without any really rhyme or reason. And it applies
you're exactly right. I mean, Bill Gates doesn't care. If Bill Gates is happy to pay $4 a gallon for gas because it doesn't affect him. But you're exactly right. There are families out there and small businesses out there that for them, that's the difference between making it and not making it. And you do this with electricity too. I mean, we have the dumbest. We talk about energy policy in the U.S. We don't have an energy policy. We have an anti-energy policy. And a reasonable energy policy would make energy affordable. It would make it safe. It would make it inexpensive. It would make it reliable. Instead, we have a policy that makes it expensive, makes it difficult, it makes it, and so we pay at the pump, we pay an electric bill, we pay in our heating bill, and this is what congressmen like to do in Washington, and quite frankly, the president, it seems to me, is this way you're cussing at the gas company, you're cussing at the electric company, not them. So they don't tax you personally. They just put in place rules and regulations that mean that you pay more. And I would just call that a tax. It's just that they're smart enough not to collect it themselves because they know it will react poorly to it.
Exactly. Well, George, if you can, well, first of all, we want to thank you for joining us. But if you can give your website so people could follow you and what you guys are working on. And also, please, just for our listeners, if you could give us some guidance as to what we could do, not just us, but our listeners, in helping you guys on this effort to speak up against this project. Absolutely.
Well, first of all, our website is simple. It's just www.ff, like frontiersfreedom.org, ff.org. And then what I would do is ultimately I'd write my congressman and my senator or call them and say, please let the Secretary of Energy know that he should not be obligating taxpayers to fund silly energy projects of anywhere, but in this case, Cape Sound. It makes no sense to ask the American taxpayer to fund this, and that's effectively what's going to happen. A loan guarantee is a promise to pay next year when it fails. So that's what Cylindrical was.
Exactly. Well, once again, folks, we want to thank George Landrith, who is the president of Frontiers of Freedom. And again, you can check them out at ff.org, FF standing for Frontiers of Freedom. George, it's been a pleasure. We look forward to having you again soon.
Thanks so much.
All right, take it easy. Well, folks, that was George Landrith.